When most people go into that voting booth, there won't be thoughts of statistical inferences, systematic observations, measurements and experiments, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. Most, if not all, of our thoughts will be anthropocentric and based on anger, fear, non-empirical altruism, relationship problems, health issues, and financial situations. Most people aren't going to be able to have any awareness and understanding of their own thought processes and how they are an emergent property of their anatomy, functions, and organic disorders of nerves and the nervous system. According to neuroscientists Jonas, Kaplan, Sarah Gimbel, and Sam Harris, greater liberalism is associated with increased gray matter volume in the anterior cingulate cortex, whereas greater conservatism is associated with increased volume of the right amygdala. According to Wolfram Alpha, the anterior cingulate cortex's functions are decision-making, emotional bonding, self-control, emotional response to pain, and fear conditioning. According to that same aforementioned source, some of the amygdala's functions are defensive aggression, emotion, intrinsic motivation, and fear. According to Frank Krueger, Morris Hoffman, Henrik Walter, and Jordan Grafman of George Mason University, libertarians had higher activations in the right temporal parietal junction than determinists for low affective offenses. The temporal parietal junction's functions are mainly involved in information processing and perception. According to neuroscientists at the Hitotsubashi University in Japan, fMRI experiments illustrated that amygdala volume was larger in people who are economically cooperative and egalitarian, and that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex volume was larger in people who maximize their own welfare and profit. According to Wolfram Alpha, some of the amygdala's functions are defensive aggression, emotion, intrinsic motivation, and fear, and some of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex's functions are working memory, cognitive flexibility, planning, inhibition, and abstract reason. The truth is, no matter who is the president of the United States, most people are only able to behave based on a natural and instinctive state of mind deriving from their own circumstances, mood, or relationship with others. The fact remains that neither liberalism, conservatism, libertarianism, capitalism, socialism, or totalitarianism are based on the scientific method, statistical inferences, or evolutionary optimization algorithms. Some people will say that the aforementioned information is invalid because they erroneously believe that mental phenomena are non-physical or immaterial because they believe that numbers and language are immaterial. This is an fMRI of changes in the frontal parietal activation and math skills performance following adaptive number sense training. This is an fMRI of how lexical learning in a new language leads to neural patterns similarly with word reading in their native language. Numbers and language is an emergent property of synapses, neurons, neurotransmitters, dendrites, and axons, and they are not an immaterial or non-physical entity. Most people believe this because of fear of death or anthropocentrism. The human brain is not separate from everything else in reality, and if people think about what they remember before they were born, this becomes more apparent. I understand that different people will have different reactions to this. Some will irrationally address a solemn request or expression of thanks to a non-existent deity or other objects of worship. Some people will become angry, nihilistic, and defeatist, and immerse themselves in irrational subcultures in reaction to our reality. So what does a rational brain look like? According to neuroscientists at Drexel University, Florida International University, and Lyman Briggs College, Modeling instruction in students exhibited physics reasoning related fMRI brain activity during the pre and post instruction in the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with decision making. The left superior frontal gyrus, which is associated with working memory. The dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which is associated with self-referential mental activity. The bilateral dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is associated with affective processing. The inferior frontal gyri, which is associated with inhibition and attention control. The orbital frontal cortex, which is associated with decision making. The posterior parietal cortex, which is associated with planned movement, spatial reasoning, and attention. The supramarginal gyri, which is associated with sensory data and perception. The intraparietal sulcus, which is associated with visually guided pointing, grasping, and object manipulation. The angular gyri, which is associated with number processing and spatial cognition, memory retrieval, and attention span. The middle temporal gyrus, which is associated with contemplating distance, recognition of known faces, and accessing word meaning while reading. And the medial superior temporal areas, which is associated with eye movement. Studying physics and using critical thinking skills is an emergent property of more complex interactions between various anatomical structures and requires more than just pain, pleasure, reward, and punishment. Is there a solution to this problem? As you may already know, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020 was awarded to women who did research on gene editing and CRISPR. Scientists at the National Council of Science and Technology in Mexico are working on incorporating intranasal administration of Trojan horse peptides that consist of 5 to 30 amino acids and can be coupled to nucleic acids. These single-stranded oligodonors and the enzyme Cas-9 can facilitate access through the olfactory bulb and editing nucleotides within various anatomical structures of the brain, such as the posterior cingulate cortex, orbital frontal cortex, amygdala, and the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex, thereby mitigating the irrational behavior that emerges from neurological and genetic disorders. In layman's terms, an airborne version of CRISPR Cas9 can be administered to the human race after many tests and trials, and with data on the spread of the coronavirus, this will be a lot easier to implement with artificial intelligence. Some other options include nanorobotics, implantable brain-machine interfaces, and artificial intelligence. According to researchers, artificial intelligence will outperform humans in many activities in the next 10 years, such as translating languages by 2024, writing high school essays by 2026, driving a truck by 2027, working in retail by 2031, writing a best-selling book by 2049, and working as a surgeon by 2053.